The Netherlands just made a shocking move.
Nexperia.
Chinese-owned chipmaker Nexperia.
Europe just drew a red line in the global tech war.
The Dutch government took control over a Chinese-owned company to protect its national security. And it's happening right in the middle of the trade war between China and the US, where the Netherlands and Europe are now very clearly taking a side.
The Dutch government has taken control of Nexperia.
The Dutch economy minister says the move was driven by national security concerns.
And as we'll go into later, the Netherlands has another very strategic asset called ASML that could be used in the trade war against China.
Both Wingtech and Beijing have condemned the Dutch move.
But first, let's talk about the company that was just taken over. It's a semiconductor business called Nexperia, headquartered in the Netherlands but with a manufacturing site in Germany. With a market capitalization of over $50 billion and a 2024 revenue of more than $2 billion, it's quite the sizable company. They make about 100 billion semiconductors a year. Their products are fairly simple in the chip world, not the very complicated ones like NVIDIA or AMD. You could compare it to the nuts and bolts of the tech industry. It's used in various consumer electronics, but it's especially critical for the European automotive industry. Without these chips, Europe can't make electric cars. So it's obvious why this business is so important for the future of the European economy. It's not just important for the economy, though. Nexperia's chips are dual use, meaning that they can also be used by the military. This was proven in a painful way when, in 2023, Dutch media discovered that Nexperia chips were used by Russia. Even though the Netherlands supports Ukraine and puts heavy sanctions on Russia, the Kremlin managed to buy millions of Dutch chips through shady Chinese intermediaries. Russia used these chips in drones to bomb Ukraine, with devastating consequences. But this wasn't the reason why the Dutch government took control over Nexperia. The real issue is that in 2018, a Chinese company called Wingtech Technology bought the company. Wingtech is partially state-owned and supervised by the State-Owned Assets Supervision and Administration Commission of the State Council. That means that the CCP has say in what Wingtech does, and that it could have influence over Nexperia. But because the company was publicly traded, the deal was perfectly legal. It definitely raised some questions, though. Why is a Chinese state-backed company buying one of Europe's most critical chip manufacturers? In 2022, when Nexperia tried to buy the Newport wafer fab in the UK, it was blocked by the British government. They couldn't have a Chinese-owned company buying critical semiconductor infrastructure out of national security grounds. The Newport wafer fab was later sold to an American semiconductor company instead. But unlike the UK, the Netherlands wasn't that concerned, at first. In 2023, they allowed Nexperia to buy a Dutch tech startup, even after they did a national security investigation into Nexperia's ties to China, which didn't raise alarm bells. But all of a sudden, on September 30th, the Dutch Ministry of Economic Affairs decided to take national control over the company. The company got a notice that they could not make any adjustments to their assets, intellectual property, business operations, or personnel for 1 year. The following day, 3 top executives with Dutch and German nationalities went to a court in Amsterdam, not to challenge the decision, but with an appeal to intervene. Clearly, something was off with the Chinese CEO controlling Nexperia, who was soon stripped of his powers and suspended from his positions. All of Wingtech's shares in the company were placed under management by an unnamed individual. All of this was revealed to the public on October 12th. It was a shocking news item, because a government seizing a company seems out of bounds in a free market economy. However, there was clearly something going very wrong at that company. The Dutch government didn't give a whole lot of details, but said that there was a threat to the continuity and safeguarding of crucial technological knowledge and capabilities on Dutch and European soil. Wingtech could have been trying to steal intellectual property and transfer it to a competitor in China, or could have tried to shift manufacturing over to China. But the move could have also been part of a larger geopolitical chess game. The United States clearly wants Europe to reduce its dependencies on China, and it has a lot of influence in the Netherlands through NATO. Over in the European Union and Brussels, they're also concerned with China's influence over the company. Member states like Germany have whole industries who rely on Nexperia's chips, and they can't deal with potential risks from China. The EU has been in close contact with the Netherlands, and they might have pushed the Dutch government over the edge. The legal justification for the takeover was a Dutch law called the Goods Availability Act. It was created in 1952 to prepare the economy for a potential war with the Soviet Union. Critics say that the law was used creatively to target a company, but others point out that China has already become a huge national security threat, especially after China made moves to weaponize its rare earth mineral monopoly. If China restricts access to rare earths in Western countries, it could seriously hurt their economy. A rare earth mineral shortage means you can't make smartphones, electric vehicles, wind turbines, and even most modern defense equipment. It would be a disaster. However, the Netherlands had one card left to play that has the potential to seriously set back the Chinese economy. With their company, ASML, they have a near monopoly on the machines that make chips, called lithography machines. The Dutch economy minister recently said that the company is the crown jewel of the Netherlands, and he's right. It's the Netherlands' biggest company by far in terms of market cap, and it's valued at over $300 billion currently. This also makes it the most valuable tech company in Europe, and the third most valuable company in the EU. Now, before we go into the geopolitics of this all, it's worth covering how ASML got here, because it was no easy feat. ASML was actually founded by two parent companies, namely Philips and ASM International. Philips was once a world-leading consumer electronics company, placed within the top 20 companies worldwide, before its downfall in recent decades. ASM International was a smaller company involved in semiconductor manufacturing technology. In the 70s and 80s, both companies were looking into technology called photolithography. Now, I'm not going to bore you with the details, but basically, photolithography uses UV light to make a precise blueprint on a silicon wafer. This wafer is then chemically processed, and you end up with functioning semiconductors. The only downside is that this process of photolithography is incredibly complex. Philips and ASM International quickly realized they needed a combination of capital and expertise. So, in 1984, they founded ASM Lithography, which later went public under the name ASML. The company's first few years were actually pretty rough. ASML's engineers had to work tirelessly to design their first functioning lithography machine. Meanwhile, their competitors, Nikon and Canon over in Japan, were far ahead. They dominated the lithography market, supplying the first machines to chipmakers like TSMC. ASML's first product, the PAS 2000 in 1986, was not competitive at all, and during this period the company almost went bankrupt a couple of times. But ASML was kept alive by a lifeline from Philips, and subsidies from the Dutch government, who understood how strategic this area really was. And finally, in 1991, ASML launched its breakthrough product called the PAS 5500, and the company finally got some market share. But by that point, Philips and ASM International started selling off their stakes in ASML. In hindsight, it was one of the worst business decisions ever, because ASML's market cap is now more than 5 times that of both of its parent companies combined. But who could blame them, since the situation was still very uncertain in the 90s. ASML was definitely in the race, but they were still fighting head-to-head with Canon and Nikon. Now, there's really only one metric in the lithography business that really matters, and that's how small you can print individual details on the wafers. This allows chip manufacturers to make smaller transistors, which can make chips more compact and more powerful. Smaller transistors are the sole reason why your smartphone today is just as powerful as a chunky computer from the early 2000s. You often hear people talk about Moore's Law, which is an observation that chips tend to have double the amount of transistors every 2 years. But for lithography machine manufacturers, the question was if they could keep pushing the envelope. To print even smaller details on a wafer, they needed to switch to a whole new technology called extreme ultraviolet lithography, or EUV. It was first researched by the US Department of Energy, who had a theoretical plan for how to make it work. By using smaller wavelengths of UV light, you could technically make the details and the layers on the wafers way smaller. But the project would be close to impossible to pull off. You would need mirrors and lenses precise to the individual atoms, incredible software, and very advanced heat-resistant materials. Also, all of this needs to be manufactured at scale before it's even commercially viable. According to most projections, even if the machine was created, it would be too expensive to sell to customers. That's why most companies who tried to develop EUV, including Intel, Canon, and Nikon, eventually gave up. But ASML didn't. It started EUV research in 1997 and never stopped despite widespread criticism. ASML's efforts paid off, as they already had their first prototype in 2006. And in 2008, the first EUV chips were produced. Finally, in 2010, the first EUV machine was shipped to a Samsung research facility in South Korea. After the proof of concept was undeniable, ASML got Intel, Samsung, and TSMC to partner up through smart customer co-invest programs. They received ASML stock, and in return, ASML would use their money to make its EUV products commercially feasible. After a long fine-tuning process and years of investment into supply chains, the machines were finally ready for mass production in 2017, after 2 whole decades. The final product was a $100 million machine about the size of a double-decker bus, with 100,000 different components sourced from 5,000 different suppliers. The mirrors from a German company called Zeiss played a big role. They're likely the flattest human-made objects ever created, with a smoothness of less than 1 atom. A crazy comparison is that if these mirrors were the size of Germany, the biggest mountain would be just 1 millimeter. But the way these ASML machines generate EUV light is even more insane. They release 50,000 tin droplets a second into a vacuum chamber with a width of just about 25 micrometers, or about the size of a human white blood cell. The droplets are turned into plasma by an insanely precise laser and emit EUV light in the process. A complex system of mirrors focuses these EUV light bundles onto the wafer with a precision of just a few nanometers, creating a complex pattern. Even after researching all of this, it's still hard to understand how this works, and it's no wonder. We're looking at what is likely the most complex commercial machine ever built, and the researchers at ASML are not stopping here. They've already created a newer, more complicated technology called high-NA EUV. I'm not going to go into the physics of this, but the numbers speak for themselves. ASML sells the machines for $380 million a piece, and they weigh the same as 2 Airbus A320 airplanes. It takes 100,000 different people just to even make one of them. Safe to say, ASML finally got its well-deserved monopoly, and it's the only EUV lithography supplier to this day. And this monopoly is paying off. ASML recorded $30 billion in sales and $8 billion in net income in 2024. This is growing at an incredibly fast rate, because global chip demand is on a tear, and chip manufacturers are scrambling to expand production. ASML is in a unique situation as a business, because the limiting factor is not demand, but how much it can produce. So most of the money it earns is going towards expansion, as ASML is rapidly building new manufacturing sites and hiring new employees. Most of the expansion is happening in Veldhoven in the Netherlands, where ASML has its final assembly and its headquarters. But the company now has 60 locations worldwide across 16 nations throughout Europe, North America, and Asia, making it a multinational company. Worryingly for the Netherlands, though, ASML has threatened to move out its final assembly lines if the region can't accommodate all their new employees. Most of these employees come from abroad, and they need visas and housing. The Dutch government swiftly responded, allocating $3 billion to urban development and giving the green light to a whole new industrial park and a new neighborhood. It's safe to say that growth expectations for ASML are insanely high. You can see this in the stock market, where the company is trading for 35 times its annual earnings. But despite all of this, there's always the risk of competition. For example, Japanese researchers recently claimed they found a way easier method for using EUV technology. But it remains to be seen if this actually works. Most people tend to agree that ASML has a lead of 10 to 15 years ahead of any competitor, as they were the only ones to investigate EUV for almost 2 decades. And seeing how complicated their machines are, it's hard to see any company getting ahead in the near future. ASML also has billions at their disposal at the moment, so it's hard to beat the company in terms of research and development. When other companies finally catch up on EUV, ASML might have already discovered an even better technology. So it is very likely that ASML will continue to be the cornerstone of the modern tech industry. Everything from computers and smartphones to data centers and AI will rely on ASML machines. And even the biggest companies we know of today, including Apple and Nvidia, simply would not function without ASML. The same holds true for the military, which relies heavily on semiconductor technology. Understanding all of this, it's easy to see why the company is getting a lot of attention in geopolitics, as we'll now go into. You have to see this in the light of the great power competition between the US and China. Both are trying to get the most advanced economy in the world, and it's looking like semiconductors are going to play a major role in this. McKinsey estimates AI alone will add $2.6 to $4.4 trillion a year to the global economy. And AI obviously can't exist without modern chips. Meanwhile, both Washington and Beijing want the most lethal military out there, and chips are now a fundamental part of this. As the Pentagon has stated, microchips enable virtually every military system, from ships, planes, tanks, long-range munitions, radar and communication gear, to night vision, satellites, and sensors. It's only going to get more important in the future. Now, I don't mean to scare you, but things like AI fighter jets and AI tanks are coming. By 2028, the US plans to have 1,000 unmanned autonomous warplanes. Russia is currently trying to build autonomous tanks to deploy in Ukraine. All of these systems need semiconductors, and ideally the best ones out there with the most processing power. Now, in 2018, something interesting happened. The Netherlands approved an export license for ASML to export EUV lithography machines to China. Donald Trump was in office in Washington at the time, and his administration did not appreciate this. It was right in the middle of the trade war that Trump started with China, with tons of tariffs and trade barriers going back and forth. The US didn't want a technology as crucial as EUV lithography machines going to China, even though they weren't made in the US. So Washington sent a delegation to the Netherlands and began pressuring them to remove the export license. This included people from the Department of Defense, so talks were definitely getting serious. And a year later, in 2019, the Netherlands took away ASML's EUV export license to China, before a single EUV machine was ever exported. During the Biden administration, this trade war with China didn't stop, especially in the field of semiconductors. The US government continued to pressure the Netherlands and ASML. This time it was about exports of less sophisticated DUV machines, basically these slightly older models. The reason was that certain booster technologies had gone to market, which made it possible to create very advanced chips with these DUV machines. So, in 2023, after immense pressure from the US, the Netherlands also restricted those exports to China. The reason why the Netherlands listened to the US was because of its reliance on Washington. The Netherlands needs the US military for security, and the US is the biggest military spender in the NATO alliance by a long shot. There are also American nuclear warheads housed in Dutch air bases. Without American support, the Netherlands and Western Europe would be incredibly vulnerable to Russia. Meanwhile, the Netherlands and the US have economic ties that stretch far beyond ASML. The Netherlands imported more than $100 billion from the US in 2023, while they exported $50 billion to the country. America is actually the second biggest trade partner of the Netherlands, second only to Germany. China is just fourth. So it makes more sense from a Dutch perspective to limit exports to China rather than anger the US. Now, the consequences of blocking ASML exports were severe. Without EUV and sophisticated DUV machines, the US effectively removed China's ability to make advanced chips domestically. This was crucial, because at the same time, the US was banning exports of advanced chips to China. NVIDIA can't export its most advanced GPUs to China anymore, which is an attempt to hurt China's AI progress. Qualcomm and Intel are also not allowed to sell certain chips to Chinese companies, just like AMD, Lam Research, Applied Materials, and others. After 2022, China effectively couldn't get any advanced chips from the global market anymore. The goal of this was to make China less of a threat economically and militarily. Without advanced semiconductors, the country's tech would always stay one generation behind. Despite all the sanctions, though, China remained ASML's top export market. Last year, about 29% of its revenue came out of China, and in some quarters, nearly half of all ASML's business was done with China. Even though ASML can't sell the best products to China, the older machines are still useful. For things like cars or industrial machines, you don't need the best chips with the smallest transistors. And in fear of further US sanctions, Chinese firms have been stockpiling these less sophisticated ASML machines. And ironically, export restrictions have given a temporary boost to ASML's China sales. However, in the long run, the restrictions are still pretty bad. ASML's China sales are expected to tank 25 to 30% in 2025. As a result, ASML stock is down 29% since its peak last summer, and roughly $100 billion has been wiped off of its market cap. Understandably, not everyone in the Netherlands is happy about this. Some politicians in the Dutch parliament think America disrespected their sovereignty by pushing so hard for trade restrictions. One of them said that US interests are not always ours. Europe must clearly signal that we stand for our own interests and companies. The CEO of ASML is also not happy. He questions whether the restrictions were fair or even smart, saying that one of the debates is it really about national security? The other debate you start to see is, does it help us or does it hurt us? People are saying ASML is missing out on crucial revenue in China, only because the US forced them to. But it's worth mentioning that ASML is far from only a victim here. The revenue they lose in China could be compensated by new revenue in the US and in Europe, due to the phenomenon of onshoring or reshoring. In Europe and in America, politicians want to have their own chip fabs domestically, because they don't want to be dependent on others for this crucial part of their economy. Especially not TSMC in Taiwan, because of the geopolitical risk there with China. Former US President Biden signed the CHIPS Act in 2022, allocating $50 billion for domestic chip production with up to $280 billion in incentives. This has led to a chip manufacturing boom, with companies like Intel, GlobalFoundries, and TSMC rapidly expanding their existing sites and building new ones. Following the CHIPS Act, more than 90 new fabs have been announced, with companies investing more than $500 million. The European Union copied this with their own CHIPS Act, allocating about $45 billion in both public and private investments. Now, all of these new fabs will need lithography machines, which means it's payday for ASML. So the reduction of demand from China might not be the end of the world for ASML. But the trade restrictions might also not be the end of the world for China, and here's why. EUV chips are way more efficient and more powerful, but you could do the same tasks with less advanced chips. While they're using 3 or 4 nanometer chips in the US, they're turning to 7 and 12 nanometers in China. The difference is there, but it doesn't make things like automating the military impossible. In many cases, you could just use more chips to compensate for the bigger transistor size. Meanwhile, the trade restrictions haven't been waterproof, meaning that China still gets some advanced chips from foreign chip manufacturers. China's most advanced AI companies have smuggled thousands of high-end NVIDIA GPUs from middlemen countries, including Singapore and Malaysia. There's also smuggling happening through Hong Kong, which is technically banned from importing these GPUs, but some still get through. These smuggling routes are one of the main reasons why China now has its own large language model of DeepSeek. The US is trying to crack down on this illegal trade, but it's not clear if it'll ever be completely waterproof. And what's even more scary is that China is now trying to copy ASML's technology. China's best lithography company, called Shanghai Microelectronics Equipment, is still years and years behind ASML. Certainly, it's only where ASML was 20 years ago in terms of chip resolution. But recently, China has announced it will be investing $37 billion on developing domestic EUV technology. If they're throwing these insane figures at the problem, ASML's lead might disappear earlier than expected. And China's not playing a fair game at all. While it's researching EUV, it's also trying to steal intellectual property from ASML. In 2015, there were already major cyber attacks on the company, and they were later linked to China. The hackers stole some technical information, although ASML claimed no information on EUV technology was leaked. It would go wrong again 4 years later. In 2019, ASML started a case against the Chinese-backed US-based company of XTAL. XTAL was started by former ASML employees, including some of Chinese origin. They stole a software source code from ASML for the DUV lithography machines, and they were convicted in court, leading to XTAL's bankruptcy. Back then, ASML stated they weren't part of a national conspiracy from China, but many newspapers were reporting that China was targeting the company, and 4 years later, they were proven right. In 2023, yet another Chinese employee stole data from ASML. It's still in court, and it's not known what exactly was stolen. The CEO of ASML stated it was not a huge risk yet, because it was comparable to one piece of a puzzle that you don't have the box for. Because the machines have over 100,000 parts, stealing just 1 or 2 parts really won't get you anywhere. But the employee later went to work at Huawei in China, which isn't particularly comforting to hear. Meanwhile, cyber attacks on the company are only increasing, and they're probably from Chinese origin. Now, ASML wouldn't be the first company to lose intellectual property to China, as the country is notorious for stealing and copying things from foreign businesses. One cybersecurity firm in Boston said China had stolen intellectual property from 30 multinational companies, worth trillions of dollars. Yes, trillions with a T. But one thing is clear. The battleground of this trade war between the West and China has moved to the Netherlands.